Ethan had never planned to return to the family farm. The memories of that place had always felt like a distant nightmare, buried deep in his mind. But something had called him back, an invisible force that gnawed at him until he could no longer resist. As he approached the dilapidated gate, the rusted hinges groaned under the pressure of the wind. The farm stood eerily silent, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The once vibrant fields were now barren, the crops long dead, leaving only twisted remnants of dried stalks that reached up like skeletal hands clawing at the sky. The sky itself was a deep shade of crimson, as though the setting sun was bleeding into the horizon. As Ethan crossed the threshold of the gate, a chill crept up his spine, the air suddenly thick with an oppressive weight. It wasn't just the decay of time that haunted the farm. There was something else, something watching. His footsteps crunched on the gravel path, and each sound echoed unnaturally in the stillness, like a whispering voice that followed close behind. Ethan's heart quickened, and he glanced over his shoulder more than once, certain that he wasn't alone. Yet there was nothing, just the ever-growing shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnervingly with the fading light. Reaching the old barn, Ethan hesitated. The wooden structure loomed before him, its roof sagging under years of neglect, the doors slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. He knew this place, had spent countless hours as a child playing in the hay, chasing his brother through the beams of sunlight that used to filter through the cracks. But now, the barn was nothing like he remembered. A strange stench wafted from inside, metallic, like the scent of blood. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, and took a step closer. The moment he entered, the temperature dropped. It wasn't just cold, it was unnatural, biting at his skin in a way that made his breath catch in his throat. The light from outside barely penetrated the gloom within, and shadows clung to the corners like living things. Ethan's eyes adjusted slowly, but as they did, he saw it. Deep furrows in the dirt, leading toward the center of the barn. Something had been dragged, something large. His stomach turned to the thought, but he pressed on, drawn by a morbid curiosity he couldn't shake. His heart pounded in his chest as he followed the trail. The further he went, the more the barn seemed to change around him. The walls creaked, the floor beneath him groaned, and the air became stifling, thick with the scent of decay. It was as if the barn itself was alive, breathing in rhythm with his own shallow gasps. And then he saw it, a dark, wet stain in the center of the floor, glistening in the faint light. Blood. Fresh. Too fresh for a place abandoned for years. Suddenly, a whisper echoed through the rafters. Ethan froze, his blood running cold. The sound wasn't a gust of wind or the creak of old wood. It was a voice, faint but unmistakable. It called his name, Ethan. The sound sent a wave of terror through him, and his hands began to tremble. He backed away, his pulse racing, but as he turned toward the exit, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. He was trapped. The whispers grew louder, multiplying, filling the space with a cacophony of voices, all calling his name in a sickening chorus. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he backed into a corner, his eyes darting around the room, desperate for an escape. But there was none. The barn seemed to close in on him, the walls narrowing, the shadows growing longer and darker until they seemed to pulse with life. And then, just at the edge of his vision, something moved, a flicker of darkness, a shape that shouldn't exist, slithering across the beams above him. The whispers stopped. Silence fell, thick and oppressive, but the sense of dread only deepened. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He didn't dare move. Whatever it was watching him, waiting. The air grew colder still, and he could feel his body beginning to shake uncontrollably. This was no longer a place of forgotten memories. This was something else. Something hungry. Ethan's pulse still thundered in his ears as he stood frozen in the barn, the oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. His gaze remained fixed on the spot where the shadow had flickered above, but whatever had been there was gone now. Or maybe it had never been there at all. He couldn't be sure of anything in this place. The suffocating atmosphere, the whispers. It felt as though the very air was poisoned with malice, clouding his mind and distorting his senses. He turned slowly, forcing himself to look away from the ceiling and back toward the strange stain on the floor. That's when he saw it, a faint glimmer in the corner of the barn, half buried under rotting hay. Something small and metallic, barely catching the faint light that filtered through the cracks in the walls. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his instinct screaming at him to leave, to run from this place. But curiosity gnawed at him, the same dark pull that had brought him back to the farm in the first place. He crouched down, brushing aside the decaying straw, and his breath hitched in his throat. It was a toy, a small, weathered horse made of wood and metal, with wheels instead of legs, a child's plaything, abandoned long ago. But it wasn't just any toy. Ethan's chest tightened with a sudden, visceral recognition. This was his brother's toy, the one he had last seen on the night his younger sibling had disappeared. Memories flooded back, sharp and painful. He and his brother had been playing in the barn on that fateful night, chasing each other, laughing, until the laughter stopped. Ethan couldn't remember much after that, just the screams. His brother's voice, calling for help, swallowed by the dark. But here it was, the toy, sitting in the exact spot where his brother had vanished all those years ago. His hands shook as he reached for it, lifting it from the dirt. The metal was cold to the touch, unnaturally so. And as he turned it over in his hands, he noticed something odd. A deep crimson stain smeared across one of the wheels, as if it had been dragged through fresh blood. Ethan's throat tightened. This couldn't be real. It had to be some trick of his mind, a twisted hallucination born of fear. Yet, as he held the toy, another memory surged to the surface, one he had long repressed. He remembered the nights after his brother's disappearance, how he would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat. His parents had always tried to comfort him, insisting it was just a bad dream. But Ethan knew better. He had seen something that night, something in the shadows of the barn, lurking just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. And now, standing here with the toy in his hands, he could feel its presence again. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his back, right at the base of his spine, where a scar had long since faded. Ethan winced, nearly dropping the toy as he clutched at the spot, the pain intensifying with each passing second. It felt like something was burning beneath his skin, as though the scar itself was coming alive. He stumbled backward, his vision blurring with tears of pain. As he reached the wall of the barn, he leaned against it, gasping for breath. The toy fell from his hands, clattering to the ground with a hollow thud. The moment it hit the floor, the whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. Ethan clamped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing to muffle the voices. They echoed through his mind, a cacophony of jumbled words and fragmented sentences, none of them making sense. But one word stood out among the rest, repeated over and over in a haunting, childlike voice. Remember, remember. Ethan's vision swam, the barn seeming to shift and warp around him. He blinked hard, trying to focus, but his surroundings were different now. The walls of the barn seemed to pulse, the wood groaning under an unseen weight. And then, through the haze of pain and confusion, Ethan saw it, a flicker of movement in the shadows near the far corner. His heart skipped a beat, cold terror seeping into his veins. It was a figure, small and hunched, shrouded in darkness. But it wasn't stranger. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was his brother, or at least it looked like him. The figure stepped closer, moving slowly, its movements stiff and unnatural. As it drew nearer, Ethan could see more clearly. The boy's face was pale, gaunt, his eyes hollow, staring vacantly ahead. His clothes were tattered, stained with dirt and something darker, and his mouth hung open as if in a silent scream. Ethan's body locked in place, his mind reeling. This couldn't be real. His brother was dead, had been dead for years. But the figure kept coming, its eyes fixed on Ethan with a disturbing intensity. And as it approached, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. Remember what you did." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He backed away, his mind racing. What had he done? What had he forgotten? The memories were just beyond his reach, buried beneath layers of fear and denial. But now, as the figure drew closer, those memories clawed their way to the surface. And then, like a jolt of electricity, it hit him. The night his brother disappeared, Ethan hadn't just been a witness. He had been the cause. The realization tore through him like a knife, leaving him gasping for air. He had led his brother into the barn that night, told him about the strange voices he had heard, dared him to follow. It was all a game, an innocent childhood dare. But something had answered the call. Something dark, something hungry. And when his brother had screamed, Ethan had run. He had run and never looked back. Tears blurred his vision as the figure reached him, standing just inches away now. The boy, his brother, reached out, his cold, skeletal fingers brushing against Ethan's arm. The touch sent a shiver of pure, primal fear through his body. And in that moment, Ethan knew. This wasn't just a memory. This was retribution. The barn was alive with the weight of his guilt, and the shadows were closing in. Ethan's mind reeled as the ghostly figure of his brother stood before him, eyes hollow and lifeless, yet filled with an accusation that cut deeper than any knife. The barn seemed to pulse around him, the air thickening with every second that passed. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The truth that he had long buried was now glaringly, terrifyingly clear. He had run. He had left his brother behind to face something unspeakable. And now, it was time to pay the price. But there was no escaping the past, no running this time. As his brother's cold fingers brushed against his arm, Ethan felt a deep, bone-chilling cold spread through his veins. It wasn't just physical. This cold seeped into his very soul, freezing him in place. The whispers that had haunted him grew louder, more insistent, filling the barn with an oppressive chorus of voices. They weren't just calling his name now. They were demanding something. And then, a voice cut through the cacophony, clearer than the others. It wasn't his brother's voice, but something far older, far darker. "You must choose, Ethan." The words echoed in his skull, reverberating with a sense of finality that made his blood run cold. Ethan's mouth went dry as the voice continued, low and sinister. "To undo what has been done, you must give something in return." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process the meaning of the words. His mind raced, searching for an escape, a way out of this nightmare. But the voice offered no mercy. It whispered of a choice, a sacrifice that had to be made. The air around him seemed to shimmer, and suddenly, the barn no longer felt like the place he remembered. The shadows deepened, swirling around him like smoke, and within the darkness, images began to form, visions of his past, his family, and the memories he had fought so hard to forget. Before him, two paths materialized, each leading to an unthinkable end. On one path, Ethan saw his mother's face, her gentle smile, the warmth of her embrace. The memories of her were some of the few good things left in his life, untouched by the horrors of the farm. But the voice whispered again, "To save your brother, you must sacrifice the most precious thing you hold dear." The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. The price to bring his brother back, to free him from whatever malevolent force had taken him, was to give up the memory of his mother. He would lose her forever, erasing every trace of her from his mind. The thought was unbearable. How could he forget her? She had been his anchor, his only source of comfort after his brother's disappearance. Could he live without those memories, without that connection? But the other path was no less horrific. In the swirling darkness, Ethan saw a figure, himself, but twisted, altered, consumed by something dark and unrecognizable. This was the other choice. To stop the entity, Ethan would have to absorb its darkness into himself, to take on its burden and become a vessel for the evil that had haunted the farm for generations. He would be the new guardian, bound to the farm, forever cursed to watch over the malevolent force. It would devour his soul slowly, piece by piece, until nothing of him remained but a hollow shell. Ethan's heart raced, and his vision blurred with fear and desperation. The choice was impossible. If he sacrificed the memory of his mother, he would lose the very part of himself that had kept him sane all these years. But if he chose to absorb the darkness, he would lose everything: his freedom, his identity, and eventually his life. There would be no escape from the farm. It would claim him just as it had claimed so many before. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, urging him to decide. His brother's form stood silently, watching him with those empty eyes, as if waiting for Ethan to act. Sweat dripped down Ethan's face, his breathing shallow and rapid. His hands shook as he weighed the choices before him. The barn creaked ominously around him, as if it too was waiting, eager to claim its next victim. Time seemed to slow as Ethan stood at the crossroads of his fate. He could feel the presence of the entity closing in, its cold, shadowy tendrils reaching for him from the corners of the barn. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to flee from this place and never look back. But he knew there was no running now. The farm had him, just as it had always had him. There was only the choice, one that would break him, no matter what he decided. Ethan's mind raced through every possible outcome, every consequence. If he sacrificed the memory of his mother, he would save his brother. But at what cost? He would be left hollow, a man with no past, no connection to the one person who had loved him unconditionally. And if he took the darkness into himself, he would save no one. He would only prolong the cycle of suffering, trapping himself in the same nightmare that had claimed so many others. A tear slipped down his cheek as he looked at his brother, the ghostly figure standing still, waiting. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. His hand moved to his chest, where he could still feel the warmth of his mother's embrace in his memories. But that warmth was fading, slipping away as the dark tendrils of the farm wrapped tighter around him. "I can't do it," Ethan choked out, his voice trembling. He looked down at his brother, knowing what he had to do, even if it destroyed him. He couldn't let the darkness win, couldn't let the entity take his brother forever. With a final, shuddering breath, Ethan closed his eyes and let the memory of his mother slip away. It was like tearing out a piece of his soul, an emptiness that spread through him, leaving him hollow and broken. When he opened his eyes, the barn was silent. His brother was gone, the shadows receding. But so was she, his mother, her face, her smile, everything that had given him comfort in this world. Gone, as if she had never existed. Ethan stood alone in the cold, dark barn, his heart heavy with the weight of his choice. And in the silence, he knew the farm wasn't finished with him yet. The silence that followed Ethan's choice was suffocating, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. The air inside the barn felt heavier, as if it were pressing down on him, squeezing the breath from his lungs. For a moment, he stood there, numb, staring at the space where his brother's ghost had vanished. The pain of what he had done, of erasing his mother from his mind, was still fresh, like an open wound. But now, something far worse was creeping in, something darker, more insidious. The barn had gone quiet, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that buzzed in the back of your skull, like a pressure building before a storm. Ethan could feel it, the presence of something watching him, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. His skin prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes tracking his every move. He turned slowly, scanning the dimly lit barn, but the shadows clung thick and unmoving. Yet, he knew they were alive. He could feel it in his bones. And then, the whispers returned, soft at first, barely audible, like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. But they were there, unmistakable, slithering through the darkness like 100 voices speaking at once. Ethan's heart quickened. The whispers weren't coming from one direction. They seemed to emanate from everywhere surrounding him, filling the space with a cacophony of sinister murmurs. They were different from before, no longer pleading, no longer calling his name. Now they spoke of something darker, something ancient and malevolent. The harvest, the blood, the words curled through the air, wrapping around Ethan like a noose. He could feel the weight of them pressing into his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the skin on the back of his neck crawling as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "It's not over. It will never be over." Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears as he stumbled backward, his back hitting the rough wooden wall of the barn. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, crawling along the ground like tendrils of smoke, inching closer. He could feel them reaching for him, cold and intangible, yet somehow solid in their threat. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one pulling more terror into his lungs. Suddenly, something moved in the rafters above. A faint creaking sound echoed through the barn, the groaning of wood bending under weight that shouldn't have been there. Ethan's eyes snapped upward, his heart hammering in his chest. The barn's rafters were thick with darkness, the beams barely visible through the shadows that seemed to pulse and twist with life. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, just for a split second, slipping between the beams. His breath caught in his throat as he strained to see, but whatever it was had vanished, leaving nothing but the oppressive dark. Ethan's hands shook as he pulled his gaze away from the ceiling, forcing himself to focus on the ground. But the barn was no longer the same. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing with a life of their own. The wooden planks under his feet creaked and groaned, as if something was moving beneath them, crawling just beneath the surface. His eyes darted around, desperately searching for the source of the disturbance. But the barn offered no answers, only shadows that shifted and writhed like living things. And then the door creaked, a low, drawn-out sound, like the exhale of some ancient beast. Ethan's head snapped toward the entrance. The door, which had been firmly shut moments ago, was now ajar, swinging slowly on its rusted hinges. The faint glow of moonlight filtered through the gap, casting a thin beam of pale light across the floor. Ethan's stomach twisted with dread. He hadn't opened the door. The whispers surged again, louder now, more insistent. "Come closer, see what's waiting." The words were like poison, seeping into his mind, twisting his thoughts. He couldn't think straight, couldn't focus. The shadows on the floor seemed to stretch toward the door, as if they were beckoning him, pulling him closer to whatever horror lay outside. Ethan shook his head, trying to clear the fog that clouded his mind, but it was no use. The voice inside him, the darkness, was too strong. With trembling hands, he took a step toward the door, his body moving as if controlled by something else. The air around him grew colder with each step, biting into his skin like 1,000 tiny needles. His breath came in ragged gasps as he reached the threshold, the beam of moonlight casting long, twisted shadows across his path. The whispers had become a roar now, a cacophony of voices that made it impossible to think. And then, just as he was about to step outside, he saw it, an imprint on the ground just beyond the door, barely visible in the moonlight. It was a handprint, small, childlike, pressed into the dirt as if someone had been clawing at the earth. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His brother. It had to be his brother. But the handprint wasn't alone. There were more, dozens, maybe hundreds, scattered across the ground, leading away from the barn into the dark fields beyond. Panic surged through Ethan's veins, a cold, hard fear that gripped his chest like a vice. Something was drawing him outside, something unnatural and relentless. But as he stood there, on the edge of the doorframe, something shifted in the darkness. The shadows that had seemed so passive moments ago now writhed violently, taking shape, forming figures that moved toward him. The darkness was no longer just a presence. It was alive, and it was coming for him. Suddenly, the barn groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through Ethan's bones. The floor beneath him trembled, and for a brief moment, he thought the entire structure would collapse around him. The whispers reached a fever pitch, the voices shrieking in his mind, urging him to step outside, to embrace the terror that awaited him. But something held him back, something deep inside, a flicker of resistance against the overwhelming dread. And then, as if sensing his hesitation, the shadows at the edge of the field stopped. They stood still, silent, watching him with unseen eyes. The barn door creaked once more, swinging open wider, beckoning him into the night. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest as he fought against the pull of the darkness, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to flee. But he couldn't. Not yet. With one final breath, Ethan stepped through the door, into the cold embrace of the night. The shadows waited, patient and still, their presence palpable, their intent clear. The whispers had fallen silent, leaving only the deafening sound of his own heartbeat to fill the void. And then, the shadows moved again. As Ethan stepped into the cold night air, a suffocating sense of dread settled over him. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, sickly glow over the fields that stretched endlessly before him. The once familiar landscape of the farm had transformed into something nightmarish, twisted by the malevolent force that now gripped the land. The ground was littered with handprints, small, childlike, etched into the dirt as if clawed by desperate fingers. But it wasn't just the physical world that had changed. Ethan's own mind was beginning to unravel, and the farm itself seemed to be feeding off his fear. The darkness was alive. It writhed and twisted in the corners of his vision, always just out of reach, like a predator stalking its prey. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the fields, searching for any sign of what was out there. But it wasn't what he could see that terrified him. It was what he couldn't. The shadows seemed to ripple and shift, as if something was moving within them, watching, waiting. And then, the whispers returned. This time, they were different. No longer just a murmur in the background. They were sharp, insidious, cutting through the stillness of the night like blades. They echoed in Ethan's mind, distorting his thoughts, twisting his perception of reality. You're not alone. You never were. The voice was both familiar and foreign, a distortion of something he had once known. His body trembled as the words wrapped around him like a cold shroud. He tried to shake them off, to resist, but the fear was already taking root, warping everything around him. The field before him seemed to stretch on forever, each row of dried, brittle stalks bending under a wind that didn't exist. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps as his vision began to blur. Shapes formed in the distance, dark, indistinct figures that moved in and out of the shadows, flickering like dying embers. They weren't human. He knew that instinctively. They were something else, something born from the dark corners of his mind, brought to life by the malevolent force that controlled the farm. His fear became a living thing, coiling in his gut like a snake, tightening with each passing second. Ethan felt his hands begin to tremble uncontrollably as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It's coming. You can't escape. His mind raced, grasping for any semblance of control, but it was slipping away, his grip on reality fraying at the edges. Suddenly, he heard it, a soft rustling in the field, like something moving just beyond the reach of the moonlight. His heart nearly stopped. Ethan froze, every muscle in his body tense, his senses screaming for him to run. But he couldn't move. It was as if the darkness itself had wrapped around his legs, holding him in place, forcing him to confront whatever was out there. The sound came again, closer this time, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted to the edge of the field, where the darkness was thickest, and for the briefest of moments, he saw something. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing at the edge of the shadows. Its limbs were grotesquely elongated, its face obscured by the dark, but Ethan could feel its eyes on him. Cold, hungry, waiting. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple, like heat rising from a fire. Except this was no fire. This was something far worse. The whispers in his mind crescendoed, filling his head with chaotic, disjointed thoughts. It's coming for you. It always was. Ethan's legs finally responded, and he stumbled backward, his heart slamming against his ribs. His breathing was shallow, panicked. He had to get away, had to escape the farm, but every direction felt the same. There was no safety, no sanctuary. The shadows stretched out across the field like tendrils, reaching for him, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. His vision swam, the world spinning as his terror took hold, twisting everything into a grotesque distortion of itself. Then came the visions. At first, they were flashes, brief glimpses of horrors he couldn't fully comprehend. His brother's face, gaunt and hollow-eyed, staring at him from the darkness. The barn, once a place of childhood innocence, now a charnel house soaked in blood. His mother's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling out to him from the depths of his mind. "Ethan, help me." But these weren't just memories. They were manifestations of his deepest fears, dredged up from the recesses of his mind by the malevolent force that controlled the farm. The visions intensified, becoming more vivid, more real. Ethan saw himself standing in the field, but it wasn't him. It was a twisted version of himself, consumed by the darkness, his eyes black and soulless. The whispers urged him forward, pulling him toward the figure, toward his own destruction. "Give in. You belong here. You always have." The words wrapped around his mind like chains, dragging him down into the depths of his own terror. Ethan's legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to his knees in the dirt. His body trembled violently, the fear overwhelming him, drowning him in its relentless grip. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating, consuming. He could feel the presence of the figure in the field, watching him, waiting for him to succumb. The whispers became a roar, filling his ears with their terrible command. "Give in. Accept it." And then something shifted. For a brief moment, there was clarity, a single thought that broke through the fog of terror. Ethan gripped the ground beneath him, his fingers digging into the cold, hard earth. No, he wouldn't give in. He couldn't. The farm wanted to break him, wanted to claim him like it had claimed so many before, but he wouldn't let it. Not yet. Not like this. With a surge of defiance, Ethan pushed himself to his feet, his body shaking, but his mind clear. The whispers faltered, just for a moment, as if the force controlling them hadn't expected resistance. The shadows recoiled slightly, and Ethan took a step back toward the barn, his eyes locked on the figure in the distance. The terror was still there, gnawing at the edges of his sanity, but he refused to let it consume him. The farm wouldn't win. Not yet. Ethan stood on the edge of the fields, his heart pounding as he felt the weight of the night closing in around him. The shadows stretched long and deep across the land, curling like dark fingers reaching for his soul. The barn loomed behind him, its once familiar structure now a twisted monument to the horrors that had unfolded there. He had made his choice, sacrificed his memories, and now he was standing at the precipice of something far more terrifying, confronting the force that had haunted this farm for generations. The air grew colder, biting at his skin like icy claws, and the whispers that had plagued him from the beginning surged back with a vengeance. This time, they weren't distant murmurs or faint echoes. They were loud, deafening, filling his ears with a chaotic cacophony of voices that overlapped, blending into one another until he could barely make sense of them. "You can't escape. You are ours. We are you." The words twisted and distorted, like 1,000 different voices speaking at once, each one dripping with malice. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tightening under the weight of their terrible meaning. But something else lingered in the air, something that made Ethan's blood run cold. A presence. It was no longer just in the shadows, lurking on the periphery of his vision. It was here now, with him. He could feel it, its cold, oppressive energy radiating from somewhere close. The weight of it pressed down on his mind, clawing at the edges of his sanity, and as much as he wanted to deny it, he knew what it was. The entity, the malevolent force that had claimed his brother, his family, and now sought to claim him. Ethan turned slowly, his body trembling as he faced the barn. The once sturdy structure now seemed to breathe with a life of its own, its walls pulsing as though the very wood had become flesh. The air inside the barn shifted, swirling in a dark vortex, and from within that blackness, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, indistinct, formless, a mass of pure darkness. But then, slowly, horrifyingly, it began to take shape. A figure stepped forward from the swirling shadows, impossibly tall and gaunt, its limbs elongated and grotesque. Its body seemed to flicker and shift as if it were made of smoke, never fully solid, always on the verge of dissolving back into the darkness. But its face, if it could even be called a face, was the most horrifying of all. It was featureless, a smooth expanse of pale, translucent skin stretched too tightly over a skull that seemed too large for its frame. Where eyes should have been, there were only deep, hollow pits, and from within them emanated a cold, lifeless light. The entity stood before Ethan, towering over him, its presence filling the air with a tangible malice. The whispers quieted for a moment, replaced by a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a sound that reverberated through Ethan's bones, a low, rumbling growl that sent chills down his spine. The entity did not move, but its hollow gaze bore into him, its presence alone enough to drive a person mad. Ethan's body locked in place, frozen by fear. His mind raced, every instinct screaming at him to run, to flee from the impossible horror that stood before him. But there was nowhere to go. The farm was alive with the entity's presence, its tendrils extending far beyond the barn, far beyond the fields. There would be no escape, not this time. The entity moved closer, its form gliding effortlessly over the ground, leaving no trace of its passing. Ethan stumbled backward, his legs shaking uncontrollably, but he could not tear his eyes away from the thing that loomed before him. With every step the entity took, the air around it seemed to darken, the cold growing more intense, suffocating. It was as though the world itself was shrinking, collapsing in on Ethan, trapping him in a nightmare from which he could never wake. And then, the whispers returned, but this time they came from the entity itself. Its mouth did not move. Indeed, it had no mouth. But the words spilled into Ethan's mind, bypassing his ears entirely. "You are mine." The voice was slow, deliberate, and filled with an ancient, unrelenting hunger. "You have always been mine, from the moment you set foot on this cursed land." Ethan's mind reeled, his vision blurring as the entity's voice filled every corner of his consciousness. It was as though the very fabric of his thoughts was being torn apart, unraveling under the weight of the entity's influence. Images flashed through his mind, his brother's face, his mother's voice, the blood-stained ground beneath the barn. And then he saw it, an image so terrible, so impossible that it stole the breath from his lungs. The entity was not just some force of darkness that had come to claim the farm. It was tied to him, woven into his very being. Ethan saw himself, standing in the barn as a child, watching as his father performed a ritual that had damned their family. He had been there, hidden in the shadows, witnessing it all. And the entity, it had marked him that day. It had been waiting for him ever since. The realization hit Ethan like a physical blow. This was his fault. All of it. His family's suffering, his brother's disappearance. It had all been leading to this moment. The entity had always been connected to him, feeding off his fear, his guilt, his memories. And now, it wanted him. Ethan staggered backward, his hands clutching at his head as the voices grew louder, more insistent. "Join me. You belong to me." The entity's voice was inescapable, filling his mind with a terrible, all-consuming dread. He could feel the pull of the darkness, the temptation to give in, to let it claim him as it had claimed so many others. But something deep inside Ethan resisted. A flicker of defiance, buried beneath the terror, sparked within him. He had made it this far. He had confronted the truth. He wasn't going to let the farm take him without a fight. With a surge of adrenaline, Ethan screamed, pushing back against the entity's influence. The force of his will cracked through the darkness like a lightning strike, and for a brief moment, the entity recoiled. The whispers faltered, the shadows shuddering as Ethan took a step forward, his fists clenched, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No," Ethan hissed, his voice shaking but resolute. "I won't be yours." The entity's form rippled, and for the first time, it moved with purpose, lunging toward Ethan with a speed that defied logic. But Ethan was ready. He had no weapon, no means to physically fight the thing that stood before him, but he had something more powerful. He had his will, and he wasn't going to give in. As the entity descended upon him, Ethan braced himself, his mind focused on one singular thought: survival. The air around Ethan thickened as the entity surged forward, its formless, shadowy body twisting and expanding like a dark tide ready to swallow him whole. The world seemed to slow down in that moment, the sounds of the farm fading into an eerie silence, replaced by the deafening roar of his own heartbeat. The entity's hollow gaze bore into him, and Ethan could feel it. Not just the malevolent presence of something ancient and dark, but the raw, insatiable hunger behind it. It didn't just want him, it needed him. It had waited for him all these years, feeding off his fear, his guilt, his memories. Now, it had come to claim what was promised. Ethan's body screamed in protest, every instinct telling him to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot, his mind locked in a battle between fight and flight. The shadows crawled toward him, moving unnaturally fast, enveloping the ground beneath his feet like creeping fingers of darkness. The whispers were gone, replaced by a low, guttural sound, a growl that seemed to rise from deep within the earth itself, vibrating through the air, shaking the very ground he stood on. As the darkness closed in, Ethan's mind raced, scrambling for any way out. He had nothing, no weapon, no shield, no escape. The entity's presence pressed down on him, an invisible weight that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. He could feel it inside his head, crawling through his thoughts, whispering terrible things. "Give in, Ethan. You belong to me." But something inside him resisted. Deep down, beyond the fear and the guilt, there was a spark, a flicker of the defiance he had clung to earlier. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep him standing, enough to keep him fighting. He wasn't going to let this thing take him without a fight. The entity lunged, its form stretching and contorting as it rushed toward him, faster than Ethan could react. He barely had time to brace himself before the darkness slammed into him, cold and suffocating, wrapping around him like a living shadow. It was everywhere, inside him, around him, digging into his mind, his soul, trying to consume him from the inside out. The pain was indescribable. It wasn't physical, not in the way he expected. It was deeper, more primal, like his very essence was being torn apart piece by piece. He could feel the entity pulling at him, dragging him down into the darkness, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he thought he might give in. The weight of it was too much, the cold too intense. His vision blurred, his thoughts fragmented, and the world around him began to fade. But then, in the midst of the overwhelming darkness, Ethan felt something solid, something real. His hand brushed against the ground, the cold, hard earth beneath him, and suddenly he was grounded. His mind snapped back into focus, the spark of defiance flaring up once more. No, not like this. With a guttural scream, Ethan pushed back, his body convulsing as he fought against the entity's grip. The shadows recoiled, just for a moment, but it was enough. Enough for Ethan to stagger to his feet, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The entity shrieked, a sound that pierced the air like nails on a chalkboard, but Ethan didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He had to keep fighting. His mind raced, searching for anything he could use to drive the entity back, to sever the connection it had to him, to this place. And then he remembered the blood-stained soil beneath the barn, the mark of the ritual his father had performed all those years ago. It was the source of the entity's power, the anchor that kept it tied to the farm. If he could break it, if he could destroy the connection, maybe, just maybe, he could stop this. With renewed purpose, Ethan turned and ran, his legs screaming in protest as he sprinted toward the barn. The entity shrieked again, the shadows lunging after him, but he didn't stop. The cold clawed at his back, the air around him thick with the weight of the darkness. But he kept moving, his eyes locked on the barn's door. The ground trembled beneath his feet, the whispers returning, more frantic now, more desperate. "You can't escape. You are mine." But Ethan didn't listen. He burst through the barn doors, the wood creaking and groaning as they swung open, and stumbled into the dark, cold interior. The smell of blood hit him immediately, strong, metallic, overpowering. The stain was still there, in the center of the barn, fresh and glistening, as though the ritual had been performed only moments ago. Ethan fell to his knees before the mark, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the earth. The blood was warm, sticky, pulsing with a life of its own, and the moment his fingers brushed against it, the whispers surged back, louder than ever before. "Stop. You cannot break what has been bound." The entity's voice roared in his mind, but Ethan didn't stop. He pressed his hands into the soil, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as the darkness swirled around him, closing in. His vision blurred as the shadows descended, the cold pressing in from all sides. But Ethan's hands remained steady. He dug into the earth, clawing at the soil, tearing at the roots of the darkness that had taken hold here. The pain in his chest intensified, but he pushed through it, his mind focused on one singular goal: breaking the bond. The shadows screamed in fury, the barn shaking violently as the entity's grip tightened around him. But Ethan wouldn't stop. His hands were slick with blood, his own, the earth's, he couldn't tell. But he kept digging, deeper and deeper, until finally his fingers closed around something solid, something cold. The knife. It was the blade his father had used to bind the entity to the farm, buried deep beneath the soil, hidden for all these years. Ethan's heart raced as he pulled it free, the ancient, blood-stained weapon gleaming in the dim light. The entity shrieked again, louder this time, more desperate. "No, you cannot break the pact." But Ethan didn't hesitate. He raised the knife high above his head, his body shaking with exhaustion, with fear, but his mind clear. And with one final, desperate scream, he brought the blade down, plunging it into the earth. The ground erupted beneath him, a shockwave of dark energy blasting through the barn, tearing through the walls, the roof, the very air itself. The shadows writhed and twisted, shrieking in agony as the bond was severed, their form dissolving into nothingness. Ethan was thrown back, his body slamming against the barn wall, the wind knocked from his lungs. And then, just like that, it was over. The shadows were gone. The whispers had fallen silent. Ethan lay on the cold, hard ground, his body aching, his breath ragged. The entity was gone, the connection broken. But as he stared up at the now empty barn, he couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered, that some part of the darkness had not fully been erased. The farm was silent, but the terror still hung in the air. Ethan lay on the cold, hard ground of the barn, his chest rising and falling with shallow, ragged breaths. The silence that followed the severing of the entity's bond was almost deafening, a void where the whispers and darkness had once been. His body ached, bruised from the force of the blast, but it wasn't the physical pain that troubled him the most. It was the weight of the atmosphere, the oppressive stillness that hung over the farm like a suffocating blanket. He had defeated the entity, or at least, he thought he had. But the terror wasn't gone, not entirely. The knife lay discarded on the blood-stained ground, its ancient, rusted blade now dull and lifeless. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, wincing at the sharp pain in his ribs. He stood for a moment, staring at the spot where the shadows had once writhed and screamed, where the darkness had tried to consume him. The blood that had soaked the earth was now dry, a dark stain that seemed to pulse faintly under the moonlight. It was over. It had to be over. But deep down, Ethan knew something was wrong. The silence was too thick, too unnatural. The barn, though now devoid of the immediate presence of the entity, still felt alive, like it was holding its breath, waiting. The shadows no longer crawled at the edges of his vision, but there was a lingering darkness, something just beneath the surface, something that hadn't fully gone away. Ethan felt it in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing sense that the battle wasn't truly won. He stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against his skin. The farm stretched out before him, bathed in the pale, ghostly light of the moon. Everything looked the same as before. The dried, lifeless fields, the wind-twisted trees. But now, it felt different. The land was quieter than it should have been. Not even the wind rustled through the leaves. The stillness was unnerving, like the calm before a storm that never came. Ethan's eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any movement, any sign of life. But the world remained deathly still. As he walked toward the edge of the field, his footsteps crunching on the brittle grass, a sense of dread began to creep up his spine. There was no relief, no sense of victory. If anything, the air was heavier, the atmosphere more charged with unseen energy. It was as if the land itself was watching him, waiting for something. Ethan's mind raced with the memories of what had just happened. The ritual, the entity, the terrible choice he had made to break the bond. But had he truly destroyed it, or had he simply awakened something worse? A soft sound broke the silence, a faint rustling from behind him. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he spun around, his eyes wide. The barn stood motionless, its doors creaking slightly in the breeze. For a moment, he thought it was just the wind, but then he saw it, a figure. It was standing in the doorway of the barn, half obscured by shadow. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he squinted, trying to make out the details, but the figure was too far away, too shrouded in darkness. His pulse quickened, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. It couldn't be the entity. He had destroyed it. He had severed the bond. But then, who or what was standing there? The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him, silent and still. Ethan's heart raced, his mind flooded with panic. He wanted to move, to run, but his legs felt like lead. The figure was too familiar. There was something about the way it stood, the shape of it, the way the shadows clung to it like a second skin. And then, slowly, the figure stepped forward into the light. It was his brother. Ethan's body went cold. His legs almost gave out as he took a step back, his mind reeling. It couldn't be. His brother was gone. He had been gone for years, taken by the darkness that had plagued the farm. And yet, here he was, standing in the doorway of the barn, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and empty. Ethan's mouth went dry, his pulse thundering in his ears. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the figure of his brother stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. There was no malice in his eyes, no sign of the entity's influence, but there was something off, something deeply unsettling. His skin was too pale, his movements too stiff, too unnatural. As he moved closer, Ethan saw it, the faint outline of the shadow, still clinging to him, a dark mist that lingered just beneath the surface. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he took another step back, his mind racing. His brother spoke, his voice soft, distant, as if coming from a great distance. "Ethan, you didn't save me." The words sent a chill through Ethan's entire body. His brother's voice, once familiar and warm, was now hollow, emotionless, as though he were reciting a script he barely understood. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He had fought so hard, risked everything to break the bond, to save his brother's soul from the entity's grip. But as he stared at the figure before him, a sickening realization began to take hold. His brother wasn't free. The darkness hadn't been destroyed. It had merely changed, transformed. His brother wasn't his brother anymore. The entity hadn't been vanquished. It had found a new host. Ethan stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. His brother's form shifted, the shadows clinging to him thickening, twisting, becoming more solid, more real. His eyes, once empty and hollow, began to glow faintly with a pale, eerie light. The whispers returned, faint at first, Then, growing louder, more insistent. You cannot escape. It's not over. The darkness that Ethan had fought so hard to destroy had never left. It had simply found a new way to torment him, a new form to inhabit. His brother was now its vessel, a puppet controlled by the malevolent force that had haunted their family for generations. And Ethan knew, with a sinking feeling of dread, that the farm would never truly be free. The entity was part of it, part of him, and it always would be. Terror gripped Ethan's chest as the figure of his brother moved closer, the darkness swirling around him like a living thing. The farm was alive with it now, the very ground beneath his feet vibrating with the presence of the entity. It wasn't just the barn. It wasn't just the fields. The entire farm was cursed, bound to the entity in ways Ethan could never fully understand. And he, too, was bound to it. The figure stopped just a few feet from him, its hollow eyes staring into his soul. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with fear. He wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The farm was his prison, and the entity would never let him leave. "You didn't save me, Ethan," his brother whispered again, his voice low and cold. "Now you're one of us." And in that moment, Ethan understood. The terror, the horror, the nightmare, it would never end. The entity had claimed him, just as it had claimed his brother, his father, and everyone before him. The bond had never been broken. It had simply shifted, evolved. And now, the darkness would live on, through him, through his brother, through the farm. Ethan's scream echoed into the night, but there was no one left to hear it.